In the year 1937, in the dying days of the Great Depression, a strange, diminutive man with eyes like chipped blue glass and a coat sewn from countless American flags stood before a joint session of the U.S. Congress. He wasn't a senator, a lobbyist, or a diplomat. He was King Zero, the self-proclaimed monarch of America's vast, unseen nation, the hobos, the drifters, and the forgotten souls of the rail lines. He was there to demand something astonishing, a staggering $10 billion from the federal government, not as charity, but as payment for an alleged decades-old debt. And Congress was actually listening. Part 1. The Ghost in the Machine. The man who called himself James A. Michener, though he used a dozen aliases over the years, was an anomaly woven into the fabric of 20th century America. He was, to the world he chose to inhabit, King Zero, the undisputed ruler of a shadowy, decentralized populace that stretched from the stockyards of Chicago to the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest. He was the most successful, most audacious con artist in U.S. history, and the subject of one of the strangest governmental investigations that unfolded quietly behind the scenes of the New Deal era. His origins were appropriately murky. Born around 1878, likely in Ohio or Pennsylvania, he spent his youth in the anonymity of the working poor. The seeds of his future kingdom were sown in the late 1900s when he first rode the rods, jumping freight trains to find work, becoming intimately familiar with the complex, unwritten laws and hierarchies of the itinerant workforce. These were the men and women who built the infrastructure of America, laying tracks, harvesting crops, mining coal. They were vital, yet invisible. Michener, or Zero, saw not desperation, but a power vacuum. He observed how these hundreds of thousands of hobos, tramps, and bums, a distinction he often blurred for his own purposes, operated under a crude yet effective system of mutual aid. He realized that if he could formalize that system, centralize its authority, and most importantly, brand it, he could control it.
The birth of the IOUT. In 1910, he declared the formation of the International Order of the Union of the Tramps, IOUT. It was a masterpiece of organizational fiction. Zero crafted a constitution, complete with articles, bylaws, and a mandatory initiation fee, usually 50 cents, a hefty sum for a transient worker. He printed elaborate, official-looking membership cards and IOUT passes that he claimed would guarantee safe passage on any railroad and lodging in any hobo jungle. While the passes were worthless to the rail barons, they became social currency among the hobos themselves, a signal of belonging and a supposed guarantee of fair play. Zero was an unparalleled self-promoter. He was short, maybe 5'4", but possessed a booming voice and the theatrical flair of a revival preacher. He would stride into a hobo camp, a jungle, in his increasingly peculiar attire, a formal suit jacket over patched denim, a bowler hat, and always the lapel pin bearing his self-designed royal crest. He mastered the secret language of the rails, the chalked symbols known as the hobo signs, and integrated himself so thoroughly that few doubted his authority. He wasn't just a leader, he was the authority on the hobo nation. Zero's genius lay in his ability to leverage the perception of a vast, disciplined organization for tangible, non-hobo-related gain. His primary target? The American railroads. The Rail Baron's Ransom. For decades, the major railroad companies, the Santa Fe, the B&O, the Union Pacific, had struggled with the persistent and costly problem of deadheading and freight theft. Hobos riding illegally cost the companies millions in lost revenue, safety issues, and operational delays. They were too numerous and too fast to eliminate. In the 1920s, King Zero made his move. He approached the executives of the various lines not as a vagrant, but as a negotiator. His proposition was breathtaking in its audacity. He essentially stated, "I control the tramps. I am the only man who can guarantee you a reduction in illegal passengers and a decrease in freight car pilfering. In exchange for my services in policing the nation's railroads, you will pay me an annual stipend." And astonishingly, they did. Zero convinced several major rail lines that he could maintain order among the itinerants. The companies, desperate for a cost-effective solution, quietly began to pay him. The payments were structured to look like consultancy fees, or sometimes donations to the National Organization for Itinerant Workers' Benevolence. These payments were a fraction of their losses, yet a king's ransom to King Zero. By the late 1920s, before the crash, his yearly take from the railroads alone was estimated to be in the low six figures, a private, secret tax on American infrastructure paid to a homeless man.
Part 2. The Ghost Fleet and the Debt. The Great Depression was not a disaster for King Zero. It was a demographic boom. As unemployment skyrocketed, millions of formerly settled Americans took to the rails. Zero's membership rolls, and more importantly, his collected fees, swelled. He claimed to command a population of over 3 million subjects. While wildly exaggerated, his perceived power became the central pillar of his next and most spectacular deception. This is where the story pivots from a clever swindle to a high-stakes political farce that touched the highest levels of the U.S. government. The Great War Racket. Zero's masterstroke was to fabricate a massive, unassailable historical debt. He claimed that during World War I, his organization, the IOUT, had been crucial to the war effort. He disseminated a detailed, entirely false story that in 1917 and 1918, the hobos, under his secret direction, had performed essential and highly dangerous duties for the War Department. These duties included transport of munitions, riding and protecting secret ghost trains loaded with explosives and war material, avoiding German spies and saboteurs. Infrastructure security, guarding railroad bridges, tunnels, and key telegraph lines from enemy agents on American soil. The hobo draft. Zero claimed he secretly mobilized hundreds of thousands of hobos who were too old or deemed unfit for the regular military, but who served as an auxiliary, essential labor force, building temporary barracks and working in war factories. For these patriotic services, Zero claimed the War Department had promised the IOUT a post-war bonus and a massive one-time payment, a debt that was subsequently forgotten amidst the post-war fervor. The alleged amount? $10 billion. In 1937 currency, this was an unimaginable sum, representing over 10% of the entire national debt at the time. The political weapon. Zero didn't just tell this story, he built a legal and political apparatus around it. In 1936, leveraging his now substantial, though secretly acquired, funds, he hired a team of legitimate, if a slightly ethically flexible lawyers in Washington, D.C. He filed suit against the U.S. government in the Court of Claims, demanding the $10 billion plus accrued interest. The case, Michener versus the United States, was dismissed, but Zero had achieved his goal, publicity and legitimacy. Then he employed a massive, sophisticated lobbying campaign. He sent IOUT agents, actually just paid operatives, to virtually every congressional district, spreading the narrative of the hobos' patriotic sacrifice. In a depression-stricken America, where veterans were fighting for their meager bonuses, this story resonated deeply with many citizens and, crucially, their elected representatives.
The argument he presented to Congress was simple and terrifying. Moral obligation. The government owed the men who had secured the home front. Economic stimulus. Zero argued the $10 billion should be paid out to his subjects, the millions of hobos, who would immediately spend it, ending the Depression overnight. This was a direct challenge to FDR's New Deal. Political threat. He implied that if the debt was not paid, his millions of soldiers would become a potentially violent, destabilizing force, a veiled threat of social unrest that Washington took seriously. In a staggering moment in American legislative history, several sympathetic and politically naive congressmen introduced a bill to establish a commission to investigate Zero's claims. King Zero, the hobo monarch, had successfully forced the U.S. government to formally consider a $10 billion payment based on a complete fabrication. Part 3. The FBI intervenes. The Department of Justice and the nascent Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, under the intensely cautious eye of Director J. Edgar Hoover, could not ignore this growing politically charged movement. The potential for a colossal financial and political scandal was too high. In 1937, Hoover secretly authorized the Zero Inquiry, an investigation intended to determine whether Michener was a harmless lunatic or a genuine threat to national security. The investigation, led by a young and aggressive agent named Frank Murray, began the painstaking process of dismantling the myth of King Zero. The IOUT membership records. Murray's first target was the IOUT's supposed headquarters in St. Louis. What they found was a chaotic small office staffed by a few loyalists and thousands of boxes filled with membership cards. A forensic analysis revealed that the majority of the cards were identical, filled out with the same penmanship, the same manufactured addresses, and the same sequential numbers. Zero had simply been mass-producing his membership, inflating his numbers from a few thousand real adherents to the claimed millions. The IOUT treasury was less than $5,000, as Zero was diverting the vast majority of all funds directly into private accounts across 5 states. The war records. The agent scoured the National Archives and the records of the War Department for any mention of a hobo auxiliary or a debt agreement. There was none. The story of the ghost trains was a masterful piece of fiction. There was no secret payment agreement, and King Zero had been merely a persona non grata during World War I, not a government operative. The railroad cover-up. The FBI agents, using their authority to subpoena financial records, uncovered the decades of quiet consultancy fees paid to Zero. The railroads, terrified of public scandal, had been willing accomplices, allowing a con man to build his empire to keep their own freight safe. This realization exposed a vast, silent network of corruption and corporate negligence.
The collapse of the kingdom. As the investigation closed in, Zero maintained his incredible self-possession. When Agent Murray finally cornered him in a rundown hotel in Cincinnati, Zero was wearing a custom-tailored suit and discussing his latest stock market investments. He was not arrested on the grand charge of a $10 billion swindle. That would have meant a massive, embarrassing trial involving Congress and the railroads. Instead, the government chose a surgical takedown. In 1938, King Zero was indicted on several counts of mail fraud and tax evasion. The government demonstrated that he had used the U.S. Postal Service to solicit fraudulent IOT membership fees and that he had failed to pay taxes on his substantial income from the railroads and his real estate holdings, which included a hidden, lavish manor in upstate New York. The trial was a sensation, but Zero was defeated not by the complexity of his fictional kingdom, but by the simple, cold facts of bookkeeping. He was convicted and sentenced to a modest term in federal prison. Epilogue: The Legacy of Zero. King Zero served his time, released a few years later, and vanished back into the American landscape, occasionally resurfacing in the press with a new, smaller scheme, forever haunted by the shadow of his previous power. He died in anonymity in 1963. His story remains a vital yet forgotten piece of American history. It is a testament to the power of narrative in a time of desperation, revealing the incredible vulnerability of a major infrastructure, the railroads, to organized deception. The political exploitation of economic distress, the Depression, to achieve unprecedented levels of access. The terrifying realization that a single, audacious man could force the U.S. Congress to deliberate on a $10 billion claim based on an absolutely fictitious history. The secret kingdom of King Zero was never a real political entity, but a psychological one. A nation of shadows ruled by a man who understood the profound American need for a leader, even among the most independent and forgotten souls. For decades, he had successfully governed a parallel state within the borders of the United States, collecting taxes, issuing laws, and commanding loyalty, all based on the sheer, incredible force of his own lie.